Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie.
No
Good to
worries.
see you again.
Pleased to have you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Ernie. I hope you're well. I guess we're going to be talking about what we consider might be the final treason today.
That's right, the Final Treason. And I'm going to bring up a couple of websites, Wally. And yes, the Final Treason. This is the fourth in the series. So I'll cut across to the first website. This is from the Thinking Housewife. And I find the caliber of the articles there particularly impressive. This one in regard to the collapse of the financial economic system and how there is design and purpose behind it. And the second website I want to go to is the newsletter. That's is from Judy Wyman. She's a P. Weilerman, excuse me, Judy Weilerman. She's a PhD person in Australia, and she's taken an ethical position in regard to vaccinations and the science behind it. And she's doing some very good work. And so I'm going to recommend her to our audience to have a look at that there is purpose, there is design, and there is intent behind the corona scare, the corona parody, if you like, what's going on out there, the narrative that they're sending to us. So your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, I have come to the conclusion that what we're going through is a maneuver designed to strip people of their rights, their traditional rights that were long fought for over centuries.
Mm-hmm.
When they're confining people to their homes, it's effectively imprisoning the entire population.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also removing their initiative, shrinking the scope of their lives into such a pathetic parody of what they used to be, that it is a very tragic thing. Probably, in fact, maybe a majority still doubt that this is a fraud. I think it's a monumental fraud. I think it might be. Well, I was thinking, we are living through the biggest fraud in human history. But then I thought, no, it's the second biggest, because the biggest fraud in human history is the financial system, which has been going on for centuries. The business of some small element in your society somehow securing the right to issue on their terms the money that the entire society needs in order to function. So it's a very serious situation and a terrible precedent. I don't think it's going to be only a precedent. I think it's going to have lasting consequences. I think that's the intention of it. It's to prepare people for a different kind of existence. And it's not going to be pleasant. And anybody who is concerned about the welfare of their children should be thinking very seriously about this.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's certainly not far from my area of thoughts, that it's malevolent, it's deliberate, and there is purpose and design behind it. Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Well, I think it is malevolent because it's no doubt being put forward as some kind of a great humanitarian striving to save humanity, or at least a portion of it. I think that if you think about it, this whole thing seems to be centered around isolation. And isolation can be very demoralizing.
Mm-hmm.
It also interferes with the normal communications amongst people, wherein they exchange information and they can come upon design or designed activity to support or to oppose something, to think rationally about the nature of something, about the motivation. I mean, let's face it, we are creatures of motivation. We are supposedly rational creatures who think our way into solutions and unfortunately into trouble.
Mm.
But thought is behind our action.
Yeah.
We don't just, unless we're insane, we do not just dive around without direction. We have a sense of direction and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And if that direction and purpose can be monopolized or can be dominated, then obviously we can be set in motion that we would not otherwise necessarily take. Motion which may serve the purposes of other people or other interests.
Mm-hmm.
So,
no worries. Thank you for that, Wallace. I think that's really important that, yes, a situation can be exploited and can bring
yes,
about a change in direction, even into a direction that communities or individuals would never consider going. And I mean, we're experiencing to some degree variable in different states, but essentially it's house arrest in Australia. House arrest, unprecedented, on the basis of a perceived threat. Now, historically, this is what I find interesting in a sense in observation. If people are contagious of a certain illness, then the historical work practice is to place them in isolation. Place them in isolation. They're identified as a carrier or a high risk individual because they're carrying whatever. And on that basis, even to the point of, if you like, people who are insane or people who are criminals, you place them in isolation. You don't do the reverse, and that is that you isolate everyone else. The purpose of society, or the function, if you like, of government, etc., is to uphold the law, not in a sense impose such draconian law that you can't even be free to move around. The idea of the road rules is so that if you abide by the rules, you're free to travel wherever you like, within the boundaries, the borders of that nation. Whereas in this instance, you can no longer travel. You can't even leave your home unless you've got justified reason. And the onus of proof is reversed. You've got to explain and justify for wanting to move around. Whereas before, it was you were free to move, and if you breach the law, then it's an infringement of the law. It's totally turned our life on its head. And then we say, okay, we've seen this significant change of what's going on. Now, on the basis of that, where is the major purpose behind it? Where is the principle design? What is the objective? And that's what I find fascinating with the Thinking Housewife and that website, because what they're saying is that the intent or purpose behind it is to loot, confiscate, to secure the assets of the whole world. Secure the assets of the whole world for their own personal gain. This is the New World Order. This is the money power, if you like. Its purpose is to disenfranchise, bankrupt not only the individuals, but companies, industrial endeavours, and in the end, whole nations, impoverish the whole lot and be subject to the whims and vagaries of the financial system, over and above all governments. That to me is the intent or purpose behind this scare, this latest scare. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, it's certainly interesting, is it not, that suddenly, although we were strapped for cash in every respect before, there are huge amounts of credit available to get people through this crisis. And this is not going to be money that is just handed out and becomes the property of the population. It's going to be handed out on conditions, and it's going to be repayable. So it is a huge addition to the debt load on society, which is already gigantic. I think was a $250 billion not that long ago. And all these governments suddenly have access to this gigantic pool of credit. It's rather like what happened when war broke out. The First World War, the Second World War. There were depressions before both those wars, and all of a sudden there's unlimited money, and they can produce millions of shells and tanks and airplanes and go out and blow it all to smithereens. And suddenly, where there was no money before, there's an unlimited quantity. And the effect of this is going to be to crush the population, because it's all going to be registered as debt, and it's going to fall as a burden on the current generation and subsequent generations, because this, these war debts and so on went on for decades and decades after the war was over. And I think there was one from the Napoleonic War that was paid off in the 1950s or something like that. So this is just another technique that the financial power is using to strip people of their assets and to burden them with a tremendous debt going off indefinitely into the future.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Robert. I've looked at that and the level of indebtedness, and I've actually written about it, that it's multi-generational. It's not only for the existing, and perhaps if there is an asset base within the existing generation, they've worked their whole life and they might own a home, but it also means that of course, the younger generations coming through, they have their student debt, their student loans. They have what, $500,000 or something for a home loan, plus this indebtedness to this, I call it a fallacy of the corona. Um, Essentially an abstraction. In South Australia, we've lost 4 people, perhaps, to this virus. 4 people. We're 1.5 million. We've lost 4 people. But yet the whole industry. And I was out on the weekend to buy a toaster, and shop after shop is boarded up, is shut. Not This is just recently. This is just the corona that's causing it, let alone the fact that the economy before the corona was actually in a serious decline, with long-term tenancy down in some shopping centres. To me, that's a reflection of it, that we're building compounding on compounding on compounding, where we are so lunching our economy. And the fact is that the government handing out some sort of subsidy, some sort of payment, some sort of basic income to individuals, and the individuals are running cap in hand, going to the government, government, please help, please help, please help. It's the very opposite. It's the very opposite to what they need, because in actual fact, and I'll touch on this, I think it's an important and profound point. It's the cultural inheritance that is being snaffled up. It's the cultural inheritance that belongs to everyone. The assets, like in the case of Venezuela, their heavy crude oil is now seized by the Russian government, while the whole nation is impoverished. So they get the assets. The Russian government gets the assets to exploit for their own personal gain, while the whole nation, the whole impoverished nation, misses out on the good pleasure of that asset that should be theirs. It should be theirs, along with if you like, the industrial arts to actually exploit that asset. So that nation misses out on it. And to me, that's part of the design. It's the poor, it's the impoverished that are actually having their cultural inheritance seized from them. And they're the very ones who should be receiving it. Your thoughts, Wally Klinck?
Absolutely, Arnie. And this is I think, the result of a widespread diffusion of Marxist ideology in society by those who wish to control others, and by those who actually are being taken advantage of by having these ideas infused into their minds. Too much wealth is not good. We should cut back on things. We're exploiting the earth. We're exploiting the flora and fauna. We are immoral people. We should be more restrained. And when you don't use certain things, they're gone forever frequently. That's the end of it. They were there to be used, but they're not going to be there again, because they will be falling into disuse. They won't be developed, and they will be just simply not used. And it's just a punitive attitude toward life, wherein some people, in their Puritan and punitive attitude, feel that they are entitled because of self-righteousness to control, and not only to control, but to flagellate their fellows.
Mm.
And that is what is happening. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's stemming from Marxism and from the philosophies that Marx derives. And I think that we are being taken for an enormous ride. It's the result of a long period of the distortion, pollution of the educational system.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than concentrate on the positive, it has been infiltrated with very negative ideas, and ideas which are designed to prepare people to be controlled, to yield their freedom.
Mm. Thank you for that.
And
Yep.
by the way, on the question of government money, I can prove it. I could go to the next room and bring you and show you a check for $412 that I just received from the government.
Mm.
Well, it's got a number on it. It doesn't say what it was for.
Mm-hmm.
Just came out of the blue.
Mm-hmm.
Just a check.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what it was. I talked to an accountant, and I asked him what was going on, and because I had gotten a certain requisition from the government for about $20-some or something, he said, "Oh, just ignore it." He sounded really annoyed. He said, "You'll be getting a check for $400. He said, "Just forget it."
Well, I think I know what that's about, Wal. I think that is designed to take the sting to a small degree out of what people are experiencing today.
Mm.
Yes, of course.
But they will, in 2 months or something, it'll all dry up, and people will not have resisted this thing when they had the opportunity to do it,
And
because they're getting a little bit of assistance, but it's not going to save them.
No, and that to me,
it's just putting their guard down.
Yeah, to take the sting out of it. That's right, to take the guard down so that the individual, instead of relying on themselves to work something through, to work their, if you like, their God-given right to make decisions and to fail if necessary.
And they are ruining the economy in the process.
That's right.
Businesses going out of business.
Yeah.
People demoralized. Suicides, I understand. Generally speaking, ruination. Typical Marxist program. It does nothing constructive, nothing positive.
Yeah.
It just, by authoritarianism and restriction, it is just simply ruining life.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, to look at a situation like this is what I'm seeing the inherent flaw when too much power is residing in too few hands, and they yield to this temptation. They yield to it. They think that they can conceive of something in their mind, and then they bring it about. The actual outworking of it causes ruination. That's what we're experiencing. That's what we're seeing. The concept that you can isolate the entire population to protect them from a disease, when in actual fact they need to actually build their immune system up, and that means that they need to be exposed to the disease. Now, I haven't seen the hospitals running overflowing. I haven't seen the mortality rates overflowing. It appears as if there's something dubious going on with America and England as to their statistics, as it was in going on in Italy with their statistics that was revealed last week, the week before, through our programs. And so you've got to recognise that where is the truth from fiction? Where is the truth from fabrication? Because we've got to pursue truth. And it comes back to questions like, well, if we're going to have community, if we're going to have society, can we trust our leaders with such levels of power where they can impoverish an entire nation for their own personal gain? Or do we have to actually put a limit on our leaders? And if we do put a limit, how is that done? Now, historically, you mentioned earlier on that we've fought for hundreds of years on these things, our ancient freedoms. We call them Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, trial by jury, innocent until proven guilty. These are principles of how societies and limited constitutional government. These are principles of how societies have actually evolved over time. Because don't tell me that King John from 1215 is any worse than Putin or Trump or whoever, the leaders of today. Don't tell me Xi is a level above King John. He's not. These people are just as similar nature. They, by human nature, are tyrants. And on the basis of that, they want to exert inordinate power over other people. They believe they have a God-given right to it. And of course they don't. So historically it has been. They have been resisted. And it's our turn now. We are in the forefront. This generation, this time in history, we're in the forefront. Are we going to resist? Are we going to overcome? And are we going to consider a new form, a current form, a timely form of Magna Carta? Something that actually looks at, okay, we evolved to the point of placing a political vote in the hands of everyone. And that's taken a long, long time. And women's suffrage is less than 100 years old. So, and even some countries now still don't have the women's vote. So democracy as such is a tool, but it's not an end in itself. Because if you can control the mob, you can control the majority, you can get whatever you like. So we've got to actually evolve our thinking in this, and we've got to consider that, okay, if we're going to recover what is a definite deconstruction of this civilization, which is an end in itself, the civilization is ending, we're watching the convulsions of it. If we're going to rebuild and place something in the fore that is sustainable, that is real, and that is long term, we need to reconsider these things. Things like perhaps voters' veto, where you can actually circumvent the power of bureaucracy or judges or governments, things like that. We need to, but you can't do it in a moral vacuum. And so if you're going to have something like voters' veto, you've already got to consider as well the responsible vote. You can't insist that the politician be responsible while at the same time you're prepared to exploit for your own benefit the situation, to rob Peter to pay Paul. It's a whole new way of thinking, and we've got to reconsider these things. We've got to consider it. We've got to turn away from the direction we're heading. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
There's been a tremendous concentration of economic power. We see these individuals like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and they have wealth beyond anything they could possibly make use of. And yet at the same time, people have been driven down the scale of economic standards. So the thing is, you might expect that those people would be tempted to go off the deep end and somewhat insane, which I think is clearly the case with Bill Gates, who wants to vaccinate 7 billion people on the planet. I hope that he never succeeds in doing that. But the real disappointment for me is the general population. We've been let down by the politicians. There's nothing new in that. We've been totally let down by the media, who just harp on this coronavirus day in, day out, and sort of, I don't know, brainwashing us with it. But we also have been let down by professionals like the doctors. There are exceptions. There are doctors who've spoken out and they've been very strong. But in general, the people involved in medical care have apparently largely covered up the reality of this crisis. And you wonder, now, why would they do this? Well, they do this because we have this ridiculous system whereby some authority is issuing the credit that people need to live on. And you are not going to challenge that authority very enthusiastically, because you know that your lifeblood, the money you need to live on, can be cut off. And we have a total corruption of our society because of this situation. It has stripped away our ethical standards, and it's made us all subservient in our thinking to the end of acquiring money. And you can just see now, it's become so blatant that the effect of this is calamitous. It's made it so you can't really depend on any of the institutions in society, because they're all bought. They're all bought because we do not have our cultural heritage, as you said, Arnie.
Yeah.
If we were receiving in a financial form, a monetary form, our cultural heritage, then we would be truly independent individuals.
Yeah.
And we would be able to think morally and ethically, and we'd be able to act on that.
Mm.
But they've got everybody by the throat with this employment system. It's the most ingenious method of control of a society you could possibly imagine, but it is totally destructive of the individual's ethics and independence.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was in the oil and gas industry, there were narratives that were placed before us. I think one of them was the Twin Towers, when the Twin Towers came down, and then of course the third tower, 9/11. And the third tower, which had no plane, no nothing, it had small fires inside, but here's this multi-story building collapses in its own footprint. And talking to blokes in the industry about it, and I had to recognize that they didn't want to look at the narrative. They didn't want to look at it because it had ramifications, and that was an area of discomfort. I don't want to have to look at that. I know of individuals. I don't want to have to look at the real world that's out there, because if I have to look at the real world, then perhaps I'm obliged to do something about it. And that to me is the question that's before us. And it really is a one person at a time thing. The real world is there. It's obvious what's going on. That Are we going to allow the shackles to be placed around our neck as a slave, the financial shackles? Are we going to insist on it? Because that's what's going on with cap in hand to the government. If you're going to pay me sufficient that I can just live, then I'll shut up and say nothing. Is that really? Is that who we are as a people? And in Australia, this coming week is Anzac week, Anzac Day being this coming Saturday. And the fact is that the Anzac spirit is one of independence and self-reliance, but one of camaraderie and mateship and loyalty and duty. And this spirit that's inside those historical Anzacs, in Australia's case, New Zealand, 100,000 died in theatres of war. 100,000. We're not a big population, so it was a huge loss, a huge loss. But the thing is that this spirit came to the fore, and that's really where it is for us now. As a culture, as a people, are we prepared to look deeply within ourselves and say, well, I can't ignore this. I cannot ignore it. I must actually respond. And in that response, of course, comes the pursuit of freedom, because that's what the Anzacs did, and that's what this show is about. It's about pursuing freedom against the final treason. Because don't tell me it's not there. Don't tell me it's not obvious. It's there for all to see if you have eyes and ears. Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Absolutely, Arnie. You know, it's pretty sad when you think that 1,500 years or so ago, we actually discerned the nature of power. There's only, I think, Major Douglas, C.H. Douglas, went to a lot of trouble to try and delineate the appropriate borders of power and responsibility. I think he said that the only safe place for power is in many hands.
Mm.
But you see, we have become dependent because of the financial system and inclined to go cap in hand to the government more and more. And the government has obligingly taken on more responsibility and more power in the process in administrating our lives. We are more than capable in free association of providing an enormous abundance for mankind. But with things being restricted the way they are by the financial system, that simply can't happen because individuals are not free to do so. So it's really a very distressing and disturbing eventuality to see people falling into such a state of, well, irresponsibility. Although you can't blame them entirely because they have been completely dominated by this overriding financial power, the banking system, without whose service you can do nothing, basically. It's like someone told a relative of mine, a senior person in a bank, he'd made a comment about banks, and This person said, don't criticize the banks. They can make life very difficult for you.
Yeah, that's
They
right.
can not only make life difficult for us, they can engineer major world wars,
Mm-hmm.
and they can punish us into the ground,
Mm-hmm.
pummel us into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is just what the story of humanity really is an amazing thing, but it is absolutely a most tragic thing. The way we have been misled, deceived, and abused.
Mm-hmm.
You tell me why we engaged in 2 world wars in the last century and wrecked Europe, wrecked European, the basis of its culture, all for the interests of, well, shall we say, hidden interests that had a second motive for conducting the war. So, I mean, it's really, really tragic. And but the thing of it is, the educational system has, in my view, been actually designed and constructed more over time in such a manner as to discourage people from being individuals.
Yeah.
We are not groups. We are individuals primarily. And we have to act as individuals, responsible, thinking, creative individuals, not people who just are shoved and pushed around by group mores or values and so on and so forth, because a group is really an unthinking entity.
Mm-hmm.
It's only individuals who can think. It's only individuals who can be moral. A group has no such existence. It's just an amorphous mass, and it can be shoved, deceived, and pushed into all sorts of acceptance and activity, as we see now with this alleged coronavirus.
Mm.
And people, you know, they're like, well, they're just like automatons. They accept what they're being told and don't seem to have any capacity to look at it in terms of critical thought. Now, where are you going to get with that kind of an attitude? What's going to happen to civilization? Or have you already lost civilization?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a disaster.
It is a disaster. That's right. I agree, Wally. I'm going to just cut across to a website here and let's have a look. I think it's that one. Yes, it is. I'll clear that. And this is the ALOR website, and this is our front page. And in particular, an article that was written, Peter's Denial in the Crowd, an article that I wrote last week. And I think it's really, really important because it's the influence of the crowd and how you can be swayed by it, and it's not easy when you're in amongst it. Remember that it was the crowd that laid down the palms when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on the donkey. The crowd laid down the palms. The same crowd demanded his crucifixion 5 days later. That's how easily crowds can be manipulated. How individuals in a situation like that, and Peter even denying Christ 3 times, he was in the presence of God the Son, and he yielded to the crowd. It is so much pressure, so much pressure. So it really is important to set yourself apart and set your thinking apart, and that is the purpose. That is the purpose behind this forum, is to cause you to critically think, and on the basis of that critical thinking, to choose to do that which the barons had to do in 1215. They actually started earlier than that. They took an oath at 1214, an oath that if necessary they were prepared to die for. And of course, in this last century just gone, my grandfather, 14 years old, went into the First World War. 14 years old, chose to step up, and then as a father of 6, went into the Second World War, 1939. And you think about the caliber of that, not just that individual, but the 100,000 who actually chose to do that. There would have been many more, 2, 3, 400,000, whatever, Australians, New Zealanders. But of the 100,000 who lost their life on the basis of an ideal, that they chose to do something, not to sit on their laurels, but they chose to go and pursue an ideal, a thought of freedom for future generations. It was so pressing on their mind and on their spirit, so pressing. We're at the 35-minute mark. This has gone especially quick. Your closing thoughts and comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Yeah, well, we're certainly seeing a disturbing example of mob thinking right now with the acquiescence that practically everybody is showing to what the governments are imposing on them as limitations. And let's hope that it's not as it appears to be, that there's hardly any independent thought left in society. You know, Rahm Emanuel, who was an advisor to President Obama, I believe, later became the mayor of Chicago. And when he was in the White House, he said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And is there not the perfect crisis right now? It's a crisis that makes everybody suspicious of everybody else. It alienates people from each other. It allows them to be controlled in ways that nobody 3 months ago would have conceived was possible. It's incredible. But it's a crisis that's being exploited by people of evil intent, I believe. But, you know, this also might work the other way. It's a crisis, and maybe it is making it so evident that we are victims of people with evil intent in society, that there will be a reaction. And then maybe the good crisis that won't go to waste will be to finally consolidate resistance to this constant centralization that's been going on now for decades and even centuries, and the stripping away of individual freedom, and that people will, a sufficient number of people at least, will wake up that some kind of effective resistance can be mounted against it. Yeah. So I'm not you know, every time there's a situation like this, it has a mirror image. And maybe we should take the optimistic view and say that these people are now so thoroughly exposed. We're living in such an artificial, contrived society, you know, where nothing makes sense. Everything is chaos. Everything is cognitive dissonance. Well, at some point, maybe it becomes so evident that people will react. So let's hope that that will be the outcome of the situation we're in now.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Robert. And I would make the point to our viewers, we're not talking about a majority here. What we're talking about is an active individuals working in community, not necessarily even working together, but certainly working for a common cause. And the common cause is freedom. It's the freedom of thought, of speech, of religion, of discussion, of travel, of all those sorts of things. And of course, freedom to own property. And in the case of property, you've got to consider your body as the final frontier of property. You have a right to your thinking. You have a right to what you choose to do with it. And in a sense, there's a limit on that too, because you should have a right to suicide. But you do have a right as to whether or not you're going to inject chemicals into it. You do have that right. Bill Gates does not have that right, but he believes he does. And this is the ultimate tyranny, a right over your own body as a slave. This is what he's proposing. And you've got to consider this. It's certainly quite profound. And as you say, Robert, so apparent. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace.
Well, Arnie, you know, there's the old expression, to every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes I wonder about that, because I don't always see what would apparently seem to be justice done. However, one would hope that somewhere within the human psyche, there do exist the resources to rise to the situation and to react to it appropriately. to the general benefit of mankind.
Mm.
It is disturbing to realize that many of these initiatives for power have existed through much of history, and that our revolutions, from the French Revolution to even going back to Roman times, actually, the Communist Revolution, seem to have been related to these same or similar interests, which have worked stridently and incessantly for the concentration of power. And I think Douglas made the comment, I don't believe I said it before, but I believe he went to a lot of trouble to point out that there is only one safe place for power, and that's in many hands. Now that implies that many hands will be thinking and responsible. They will not be part of some unthinking, merely reactive, amorphous mob or crowd.
Mm-hmm.
They will think as intelligent beings individually. Because as I said, a mob has no intelligence. A mob just reacts. It reacts emotionally upon being, incited.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much of that. And if the educational system can be perverted or distorted or weakened, misdirected in such a way as to cause people to flock to the group unthinkingly and at the incitement and suggestion of third parties, then you've got a very, very desperate situation.
Mm-hmm.
We need thinking people who are moral, responsible, and who are not easily led. And unless we restore to humanity the vast cultural heritage that is actually there for us to enjoy, we can't do that because then individuals don't have the security which allows them to be thinking individuals without being under duress or stress or threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very important. I mean, it's very important that human beings have a high degree of security and an opportunity to lead a cultural life where they can actually study history, where they can actually observe what happens with human beings in association and learn how to apply the principles of association in a constructive, meaningful, and successful manner, which redounds to the benefit of all people.
Yeah. Not as a collective, but as individuals. That's right. As many as possible. And that to me is we haven't touched on it so much today, but that's the purpose or the intention behind the financial proposals of Douglas, the national dividend and consumer price discount, is to place that independence, that cultural inheritance at the feet of each and every individual, not selectively, as we see with Putin and his government seizing the assets of a whole nation and leaving that nation impoverished, but rather that it's issued equitably and fairly across the whole population to a fashion that says, well, if this is what the machines are producing, if this is what the cultural arts, the industrial arts are producing, and these are the resources that we have, then it needs to be financially made possible. And of course, none of that is happening because the financial system is monopolized. It's in the hands of a few, and of those few, it's quite consistent that they are corruptible and totally corrupted by this power. So yes, a very interesting, discussion today, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your participation.
You're
Thank
very
you, Arnie.
welcome, Arnie. It's a pleasure to be a participant.